So over the past year and some odd months that I've been doing this computer flipping adventure that you've all been watching here on this channel, I have acquired a fair bit of information on the computer flipping process, as I guess you would say. I wanted to take all that information that I've showcased in other smaller videos and take all of it and put it into a complete guide, tutorial, advice thing that you can all learn from to do computer flipping yourself. So that's precisely what this series of videos is going to be, going through each step of the computer flipping process so that you can be well informed and armed with knowledge for your computer flipping journey? So if you read the title of this video, you know that the first topic we're going to be covering is the planning / goal of a build and kind of the beginning steps, the mental walkthrough that you have to go through before you even go into building and selling the computer at the end. With this specific video being planning, it might be a little rambly here at times, so to help you get through it or to jump to the information that you're looking for, I'm going to timestamp all these subcategories that we go over in this video. So if you need that, click on the little time bar timestamp thing below. Planning is probably not the most entertaining topic to go through simply due to the fact that it's not pertaining to physical hardware or performance or gaming or FPS. It's simply just the thought process of what computer you're building, but it is probably the most important part, and obviously it comes first in this whole process, so that's why we have to cover it in the first video. But ultimately, planning comes down to answering 3 simple questions, and all of these questions I generally answer with each project build that I do, and that is, what is the purpose or the use case of this computer, whether it be gaming, video editing, internet surfing, or the like? What is the budget or the price range that I'm aiming for, whether it being the budget that I have to build the computer or what price range I want to aim to sell it at once I'm done with the computer? Either of those things can dictate the budget of the computer. And third and finally, what are some of the external factors that might nudge the decision making I have while going through the project? This could be a list of things that we'll go through, but we're going to go through each individual question and how I answer them and things you might run into. So what is the purpose of the PC that you are building? Is it a budget gaming rig that focuses more on price to performance and puts maybe the aesthetics and the upgradability to the wayside? Is it a high-end gaming and streaming setup where it needs to encode and record videos while also running games at the highest settings? Or is it simply just a office PC that your grandma needs to check those internet cat memes that she still clings to like it's 2010? Ultimately, whatever your goal is, this question will dictate quite a lot about the hardware that goes into your PC, so answering this is probably the first step, and if you're unsure of what the goal of the computer is, you should probably sit down and hash that out. So what is the budget of your computer? Again, this is another key question to answer, and it can be done in a matter of ways. Usually I have 3 different ways that I answer this question, and we'll knock through those real quick. The first way I'll decide a budget is letting the price bracket that I'm aiming for dictate the budget. Whether I'm aiming to sell a $350 entry-level gaming system or a more high-end $750, $800 system, I will let my budget dictate how much I can spend. That's probably the simplest way of doing it, and it's probably one of the more common ways I've done it, and it allows you to be more fluid with your parts because you know ultimately what goal you're looking for. The second way of setting a budget is having a customer come directly to me. I've been seeing this happen a lot more often with my customer base growing, but they'll come to me and say, hey, this is the budget I have to work with, build me a computer. I almost prefer this because it gives you a very hard set limit of what you can build and allows you to work with the customer to get the specific build they want within that budget. The third way, which is rather similar to the first way, is aiming to build a system that hits a certain performance benchmark. Not based on price, but more based on where it lands on that performance spectrum. Where, let's say I have a bunch of computers built, but I don't have a mid-tier system. I have a bunch of budget and a bunch of high-end, but I don't have one that aims for that kind of middle-tier gaming experience. So then I might plan a project around that simply to fill the gap in the inventory that I currently have. Whatever way you do come to a budget, it allows you to put more limitations on your parts and getting closer to narrowing in on what exact part you're looking for to put in this build, which I guess is the goal of all of these questions, is to nail down the computer you're building. So before I show you how I actually plan out a computer, there are a myriad of other questions that you might run into based on what computer you're building. Common ones that you'll run into, especially if you're building it specifically for a customer, they might have little ideas, thoughts, or requests that change the parts around ever so slightly. Sometimes your customer might want more storage than you would recommend, so you'd have to adjust the budget on the other parts to accommodate that request that they might have. They might want a specific case, and they might want a certain look going for them. All these things you have to take into account. If you feel like you can't fit all these requests within your budget, or you feel like you have to compromise the computer because of the budget and the certain requests they have, make sure you convey that to the customer so that they know that their requests might be hindering your ability to give them the best product you can. Other things that you might want to consider that you might think are rather insignificant are the aesthetics of the computer. When you're selling a computer, especially to somebody who is a first-time computer buyer, they might look at the aesthetics and think it's a much better system than one that's kind of hobbled together. This is reinforced by the fact that if you go to eBay or actually any pre-built seller and type in gaming PC, you'll see that they all light up with that special unicorn vomit that everyone loves. Aesthetics of a PC help it tremendously in selling, so you should consider that when buying your parts. One of the aesthetics that I like building towards is that all-white computer. My actual computer that I use myself is all white, and a lot of the computers I've sold have that nice, clean, white look. I enjoy it, and I think it sells rather well, so that's just one example of something you can aim for when you're in the planning stage. Of course, not all budgets and not all builds have that wiggle room for picking things out that are aesthetically pleasing. So if you have to compromise that as you're doing a budget build or something, don't feel like that's the end of the world. It's just something to consider while you're planning. The other thing that I tend to consider a lot is what I have around me at the time. A lot of my plans will start off of one or two parts that I have in my inventory, and then it will start from there, and I'll collect whatever else I need in the purchasing process to get the final computer assembled. So now it's time to actually plan out the computer, and you might be rather excited, but it's not a very exciting process. I do this same similar planning process multiple times in a day, so you'll get very comfortable doing this if you get into computer flipping. Now, the planning doesn't have to be some very intricate and highly organized Excel sheet, though you could go that route if you want to. I much prefer doing most of the planning in my head and simply jotting down a few notes to help me keep everything in check. What this ends up looking like most of the time is a WordPad document that's been running for 7 or 8 days and has random little tidbits scribbled all over it. But I'll open up a WordPad document and I'll put out all of the parts that I think will fit in the budget and the price I can get them for, and simple things like that. I might also include links or maybe potentially like 2 different products if I'm trying to debate one or the other. But at the end of the day, I usually end up with a simple list with the parts price and then how much it costs me and what I'm looking to sell it for. And it doesn't look all that exciting. At the end of the day, that's where 90% of decision making is done. If I see that one part kind of outshines the other or is maybe too expensive, it has to be adjusted and switched out. Sometimes I just scrap a whole computer because I see that what I'm paying for it is not going to be what it's worth at the end, so I simply have to figure out a different way of selling it. This is where probably most of your mental work is done. After this, it's simply putting the parts together and making sure a few things are hammered out. So don't push planning to the back burner because it can be important and can save you some hassle down the road. So make sure that you have some system similar to this. Again, it could be different ways that you want to do it, some ways you prefer, but this is just how I've done it, and I've been doing it for a year and seen quite a bit of success, so I'm imparting it onto you. So the last thing I feel like mentioning before wrapping up this video is the knowledge that you'll need to know when going through the planning process. It's all well and good to be able to pick out random parts and find the price online, but if you don't know what parts to put with which and why, then your computer might end up being a poor choice of compatibility or pairings, and that's going to be an issue when trying to sell it. So the 2 things that I think are key to give you the information to finish this video is hardware compatibility and hardware pairing. One is much more objective, which is your hardware compatibility, and one is a lot more subjective, which is your hardware pairing. We'll go over each in a little bit of detail. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all information for these topics, but it will give you enough, or at least the tools, to find out more and figure out things that you might run into. When it comes to hardware compatibility, I'm not going to be able to answer absolutely everything pertaining to the topic. due to the fact that it's just an enormous topic within itself. Some of the questions you might run into are, does this CPU fit with this motherboard? Does this RAM run at the proper speed with this component? Does my power supply have enough wattage to power my system? There are a ton of questions like these, and no one knows the answer to every single one of them offhand, though it does help to know general things or things that you're working on in particular, such as if you're working with a certain generation of Intel chip, you might want to know all the different chipsets for the motherboard and what they do and what technology they bring to the table. If you don't know these things, I'll kind of give you a brief way of researching them or finding the tools you need to figure out these questions so that you can guarantee at the end of your project all the parts that you've picked out will work with each other and not cause any issues. So the part in your computer that interfaces with the most parts of the computer is your motherboard. It dictates quite a lot about the system that you're going to be building, so I'm going to be using that as kind of a rough example of how you would go about looking into what would work with it. So one of the most common questions that you'll need to know is, does this CPU work with this motherboard? To figure that out, you would find the motherboard, take the name and the brand name, such as like an Asus Prime B450 motherboard. Make sure it's the right product, because even in the same lineup, there are slightly different versions of motherboards that you might run into. So after you guarantee that it is the one that you have, then you can go to the support tab of most motherboard vendors' sites, and it will have a CPU supported list, and it will show you every single CPU that is supported for that motherboard, and then right beside that you'll have your memory kit compatibility list, which will also show an extensive list of all the RAM that is guaranteed to work with your motherboard. A little side note is most RAM will probably work with your motherboard, but if it's not guaranteed on the list, then there's no expectation that it will, it just probably will. This same methodology can be applied to all the other parts of your computer, such as if you want to know how many fans a case can hold, you go to the case product page and there's usually some specification spreadsheet or the like that will list off how many fans, what the clearances are, how tall your CPU cooler can be, and with that knowledge and also the knowledge of whatever you're trying to put in it, you can generally figure out if what you're all trying to accumulate in this case will fit. Another question that's asked quite often is, how powerful does my power supply have to be to power the parts that I want to use? There are wattage calculators on the internet that are pretty useful. I wouldn't swear by them, but they'll give you a good idea. But what I'm trying to explain to you is the vast majority of compatibility questions can be answered with a little bit of research and some Google searching. You'll find that probably a few other people have had the same idea or the same question, or something similar, which you can then piggyback off how they answered it to answer it yourself. So make sure that all the parts that you have in your plan that you've picked out from your budget and your questions will all work together in a happy little family. Hardware pairing is much more subjective than hardware compatibility. When you look at hardware compatibility, it says, does this work with this? And goes, yes. When you look at hardware pairing, you'll be like, does this CPU limit this GPU? And you have a plethora of questions around that, where some can be like, yeah, yes, no, what are you thinking? Things of that nature. And of course, when something is subjective, everybody has an opinion on the matter, but there is a rough, correct answer with these kind of things. A good example, when you're building gaming PCs in particular, this advice somewhat relates to more general computer usage, but your GPU and your CPU work together in tandem to give people a good gaming experience. There are other things such as storage and RAM and things of that nature. When you're talking about the main components that power your gaming experience, it is your CPU and your GPU. So for example, if you took an old i3 Intel chip that is aging rather poorly at this point and paired it with an RTX 3080, you would see a huge limit in that 3080's potential because that i3 is not strong enough to milk all of that raw power out of that 3080. You can also go the other route where your graphics card is pitiful and your CPU is a monster, and your CPU barely even knows that there's a game running because the graphics card can deliver such little power to that gaming experience. So how would you find out if your GPU and CPU are a good pairing? I cannot go through and list every single good pairing. I made a video on a pairing that I thought was actually perfect, but what you can do is take a good guess at what you think is a good pairing based on your knowledge. Obviously, you'll get better at this the more computers you build. But for example, we'll use the video that I did before, where it is a Xeon 1220 V2 paired with a RX 470. And if you look at MSI Afterburner, which is a tool used to show GPU usage and CPU usage while gaming, you will see that your GPU usage and CPU usage are neck and neck, playing well with each other. You're getting the most you can out of your parts. If you don't have the parts, a good tool to use is YouTube. There is an extensive amount of videos done on how well do these parts play together. You can simply search something like a i5-8600 with a GTX 1070, and someone has done a video on how it runs in Fortnite, and how it runs in PUBG, and how it runs in GTA 5 and the like. So you can look through these videos and look at the GPU and CPU usage and see if the pairing works out well. Again, this is a rather subjective matter, so you might see a CPU usage at 20% and be like, hey, GPU's not being bottlenecked, good stuff. Or you might see the CPU usage at 20% and be like, why do you even have that CPU in there? You're not using it all. So there's a little bit of decision making that you have to do personally, but what I like to see is the CPU and GPU being worked at about an equal measure. So that's what I tend to aim for. So as I stated before, the GPU and the CPU are not the only pairing that you have to take into account. There is also RAM and storage, your thermal solution, your motherboard. All of these parts should roughly be in the same spectrum of performance. You wouldn't want to pair a $800 high wattage CPU with a $30 motherboard that isn't designed to handle that wattage. You also wouldn't want to pair 32 gigabyte SSD with an $1,100 system, because someone buying an $1,100 system would expect more storage than a 32 gigabyte SSD. So again, these are other things that you have to take into account, and if you have no idea what you should be aiming for, you can look up computers that are in the price bracket you're aiming for and seeing what they offer. If they have 120 gig SSD, or if they have 16 gigabytes of RAM, or their power supply is more powerful than yours, you can get a feel for what you should be providing for that price point by seeing what others are selling. So that's really all the advice that I have for this video, but throughout this series we're going to be following a particular build that I'm doing, so you can see every step of the process actually physically done to a computer, and at the end we'll have a product to kind of showcase what you could have if you follow all these steps. The computer that I'm planning to do for this series of videos is a Ryzen 5 1600AF and a GTX 1070 system. It will end up being about $750 when we're done with it, and I think it would look rather snazzy. So this is the little planning thing I have for it. Again, I mentioned that it's fairly simple and a lot of the planning is in my head, but I'll go over a few of the decisions that I had to make and also how I came to some of the parts and conclusions that I did, so that you have some idea of how the advice I gave you is actually applied to the planning process. So the majority of this build actually came from the inventory that I had kicking around. I had picked up the GPU from a local deal from quite a while ago, and I ripped it out of the system because I thought that the system it was in was a bad pairing, so it took a place on the shelf to be put into a different project. I had bought the motherboard off of another guy that I had found, and I kind of just accumulated everything except the CPU and the RAM. Those are the last two things that I didn't actively have in my inventory. So with everything that I had put together, I needed to find a CPU that wouldn't limit the GTX 1070 and would fit that $750 price point that I was aiming for. Right now, with the whole COVID thing and Black Friday and holidays, it's rather hard to get your hands on a good deal second-hand Ryzen CPU. I was seeing people trying to sell a 1500X for $100, and that's absurd. So when I found the 1600AF for $150, even though it's a little more than I would like to pay for it, right now that's really all I could find to finish off the system, so I grabbed that, knowing that it would handle that GTX 1070 perfectly, and it also fit into that range of budget that I wanted to make sure that they had a good gaming experience afterwards. And then once I had most of the parts picked out, I already had a case from another project that I was working on that I'm using for this one, and I made sure that when everything was assembled, it will look relatively decent. There isn't going to be bright pink RAM or, mustard and green cables. These are things that I think are a no-no for higher end systems. Of course, if you're building a system for like $200, you might not have the options to say no to this, but when you're putting a $750 price tag on something, you should at least make it look nice. And the NR200, no, it's the NR400. And the NR400 case that I'm using for this project, I think actually looks really great. I love this case. I might actually do a little video on it, but who knows, my video schedule is all over the place. But I think at the end of the day, the computer will look nice, and that's another thing that I took into account when mentally putting all the parts together. With that said, that is absolutely everything for this video. That is the planning and goal stage of the computer flipping process, I guess you can say. So I hope you learned something. Some of this might be rather low-end, entry-level advice, and I apologize if you've heard it 1,000 times before. Also, if you've heard this information in other videos, I'm sure that will happen because there's going to be some overlap. But if you learned something, hit that like button. I'm trying my best to make a complete guide of everything so that you can follow a step-by-step tutorial, more or less. But if you don't think this is useful and I'm going about this the wrong way, hit that dislike button and tell me what you'd like to see done differently. But if you want to see the rest of these step-by-step videos, hit that subscribe button. I will try my best to keep you around, but no promises. With that said, have a good day.